Welcome to Designing the Future. My name is Kubi Ackerman. I'm the director of the Future City Lab at the Museum of the City of New York, and I'm here with my colleagues.
I'm Sundar Raman, director of engineering at Local Projects.
Hi, Kate Watson, senior producer, project manager at Local Projects.
And I'm Cathy Sigmond. I'm a research associate at Randy Korn and Associates.
And we're very excited to be here to talk about designing the future in the context of creating an interactive gallery on the future of New York City. The way we're going to present this is I'm going to give a quick overview of the Future City Lab and the larger exhibition of which it's part. Sundar and Kate are going to talk about some of the challenges inherent in designing for an exhibition on the future. Cathy's going to go through the results of a evaluation assessment that the museum commissioned to see how well we met our goals and objectives for the exhibition. So just a quick overview. What is the Future City Lab? It's part of a larger exhibition called New York at its Core, which opened almost exactly a year ago this week. And it's the first permanent exhibition on New York City's history, and certainly the first permanent exhibition on New York City's future that occupies the entire first floor of the Museum of the City of New York. And comprises two other galleries in addition to the Future City Lab. So there's two historical galleries. One is called Port City, and it covers the city's early history from the arrival of Henry Hudson through consolidation in 1898. World City, which is what you see on the right there, is it covers what we call the long 20th century up until 2012. We use Hurricane Sandy as a kind of inflection point to bring us to the concerns of the present and the future. And then the Future City Lab, which you see right there. And as you can imagine, creating an exhibition on the future in the context of a history museum, or from the context of any museum for that matter, is quite a challenge. We have no objects to show, and we have no chronology to help organize the exhibition. And so we really thought long and hard in the planning process as to how we're going to go about doing this. And maybe we can start with we can show a little bit of a video here, so as I'm talking, you can get a sense of what the space looks like and what it looks like to interact with some of the material there. But we decided early on that instead of, well, there's a number of challenges. The first of which is, as curators, in this case, we really couldn't claim to have any sort of specialized knowledge or insight into the future, since it's inherently unknowable and unpredictable. And the track record of futurologists and prognosticators, if you look in the past, is actually pretty poor. So we knew that anything that we'd present as likely to happen was actually likely not to happen. So for that reason, we made a conscious decision to not focus too much on the type of material that people might expect to see in a place called the Future City Lab, namely, seductive renderings on the part of, produced by planners and architects that show really cool techno or eco-utopias, or dystopias for that matter, but instead really organize the entire gallery experience around providing our visitors the opportunity to engage meaningfully with the material and imagine the future for themselves. How do we go about doing that? That's essentially what this presentation is about. And we're going to talk about the various interactives and experiences that we designed to allow our visitors to step into the shoes of a decision maker and allow them to imagine the future. So I'm going to quickly run through some of the components of the gallery. It's organized around these 5 big challenges for the future. Housing a growing city, having to do with population growth and the challenges of housing affordability. Living with nature deals with the integration of natural environments into the urban environment and the existential threat of climate change to the city. Getting around is a focus on transportation infrastructure and the changing nature of our streetscapes. Making a living focuses on economic development, the changing nature of jobs, and the persistent problems of poverty and inequality. And living together deals with demographic change and diversity in the city. And just quickly, if we go back, there's what you're looking at there is one of the components of the gallery. It's we call it our WhatIf Table. It's a place, it's designed as a table where people can sit and discuss. And there are cards available that say what if on one side, and then on the other, and there's pencils available for people to write in questions, whatever they want, and respond to each other. And this has been hugely successful from my point of view. We've had 32,000 submissions since we've opened, and we look at every single one of those cards, and we actually use visitor submissions to generate questions which we then pose to various experts and get a variety of different perspectives on, which is the printed panels which you see there. So those are continually changing. We have a map table that shows almost 100 maps on those 5 challenges. that is in a loop that takes about 45 minutes to go through. It's a huge amount of information and data presented. As far as I know, it's one of the largest publicly accessible sources of spatial information on New York City that's currently in existence, with a lot of a lot of additional material there. That's right. And has a great content management system designed by local projects that allows us to update all that information as new data becomes available. What you're seeing here are our activity tables. So for each challenge, we have a dedicated table where people can explore the different neighborhoods in the cities and how the challenges are manifest in those different places. More data points. And in the far corner, a strategy section where we look at different approaches that are kind of creative, interesting, unusual approaches from other cities that are facing similar challenges, as well as things that have been proposed for New York City. And on the left, you are seeing one of the activities. So there's 3 activities that were designed by local projects to allow people, as I said before, to kind of step into the shoes of a decision maker and start designing the future for themselves. So the one that you're looking at right now is for the challenge of getting around. You can design a street, and these are all site-specific, so they're in the actual neighborhoods, which you can learn about on the other side of the table if you want to make it site-specific. For the challenge of living with nature, you can design a waterfront park, and for the challenge of housing, you can design housing. And it's a really simple, intuitive, easy-to-use interface. I've seen 3-year-olds come up and start to do this. I've seen professional planners spend 20 minutes, half an hour designing one of these scenes. And the result of that process you can publish at this large immersive screen, so you can see your design kind of writ large, and using Connect's, your image in the moment is actually projected into the scene, so you can kind of see yourself in your design of the future, and that it's animated, and that animation is something that you can send to yourself and share with your friends after you've completed that. So just really quickly, some of the concepts, well, I could discuss some of the concepts, but some of the key challenges that we were facing as we planned and designed this. So one of the things I want to talk about is the emphasis on collective agency. As I said before, this is a real challenge because we had to be very careful about the curatorial voice when addressing something that's just so inherently uncertain. And we also wanted to tie it closely to the 2 historical galleries. So we're not showing anything from those 2 galleries. They're also quite interactive and media intensive, and the interactives in those 2 galleries focus on specific people in New York City's history whose actions and decisions made a difference to history. And the real lesson there is that we tend to kind of retroactively impose narratives on history to make the things seem almost preordained, like A led to B, led to C, whereas in fact they're highly contingent on specific actions by people. And the premise of the Future City Lab is that we, collectively, New Yorkers, but visitors to the gallery more specifically, are the people whose actions and decisions today will help shape the city of the future. So we call it the Future City Lab, but it really is much more about the present, right? What are our concerns right now? How are we going to react to these challenges in a way that will really determine what the future of the city is going to be like? One of the things that we really strove to figure out the right balance on is what I'm calling experience versus content, but I imagine this is something that everyone who works in the museum field deals with in one way or another, is we're really cognizant of the fact that in order for people to meaningfully engage with this material, that there is some kind of baseline information that we needed to provide them to feel like they could participate in these big discussions, because often planning challenges and discussions about the future of the city can be jargony or alienating, right? People feel like if they don't have the expertise, they can't really participate in those discussions. And so that's what a lot of the information that we provide to people is really designed to help people get there. At the same time, we understand that kind of information from on high is unlikely to have that much of a learning impact. It's really difficult to take all that information in without providing the experience of feeling what it's like to have to make difficult decisions and trade-offs with regard to these difficult questions about the future. So we felt very strongly that it couldn't be one or the other, but we strove to really create a balance where that baseline information was there, kind of as scaffolding, but that the primary experience is really one of engaging creatively, and it's not just feeling what it's like, but to be creative and playful, even especially given the kind of severity of the issues that the city's dealing with. That creativity, playfulness, and like direct experiential engagement was really, really critical to this experience. So we really tried hard to create that balance.
So jumping into how we moved ahead and actually tackled this incredibly challenging and exciting brief from MCNY was, where do we start? Well, we know that we have to make a hands-on experience that's really experientially led. We know that we need to convey a lot of data and that data needs to be refreshable and current and relevant to the visitors. And we know it needs to be fun and accessible to a wide array of different audiences. So what you're seeing here is a really early rendering, our first stab in a series of many attempts at getting this gallery right. And at first we really were thinking of a series of really smaller, simpler activities that were really siloed. Design your own skyscraper, an engagement around finances and money, a feed showing kind of live data in the city. And it really, we were challenged to take this further in thinking that this really it wasn't achieving what we needed it to in terms of an integrated approach. Moving on.
Yeah, I think one of the key things, as Kubi mentioned, this idea of how do you take different modes of interaction in. So the future is like this ephemeral thing, whether we do that through a sense of physicality or just these interstitial engagements with just data that you're consuming. As we went through this, obviously, like we created physical ideas where you're actually lighting up different aspects of the city as you're interacting with it, play around with things like AR. The problem is a lot of these technologies, although they're engaging and they do put people into a context, that what they leave with is not very tangible. We were trying to like combine that sense of where does that information really have value when they leave this experience? But at the same time, this process of gamification is really important as people like sort of lose themselves within what we've built. The experience has to feel immersive.
And also just from a practical standpoint, we broke this into a series of borough-related challenges. So we had a more integrated approach, but we still weren't able to tackle a lot of the larger scale citywide issues that Kubi and his team were really focused on. I mean, we really needed to grapple with that on a much larger scale, and the neighborhood or borough-specific challenge really didn't go quite far enough.
The 3D printed thing, I think we were all behind for a while. We were like super excited about it, but we couldn't get our army of Fraggles to start building these fast enough. So then we went all the way back to, like, again, the future has to feel whimsical in some way because we don't know what this is. And you want to leave enough of a gap for people to fill in their imagination. So we're like, okay, can we go all the way back to just something that feels like sketches? Now, again, like this grappling with the design side versus the data side, which will, is this constant play. But yeah, you can see everything from something that feels very sketchy to 3D renders, and all of these things we've seen in different games. You've all sort of experienced this with kids or like even adult games,
But aesthetically, how do we avoid this feeling dated almost immediately, right? Or too abstract, not tangible enough. So this was our next iteration where we really played with more of a realistic visual approach, but sort of collaged, layered, where visitors could start to layer in their own designs. And I think the big takeaway from this iteration was not just that people could create their own scenes, but also that on top of this sort of playful, layered experience that we're creating here visually, we're also working with actual metrics, which you can see in the top left-hand corner. So as visitors are designing, they're actually getting feedback about their designs, and that feedback system being based in real data and real analytics, that was something really powerful to us that we really latched on to.
Yeah, and as Kubi mentioned, like there's a lot of work that went into making sure that these analytics are real. Like these are actually city stats. These are metrics that people are actually playing with. It may feel whimsical and playful, but at the end of the day, we want people to leave with something that they feel like they actually contributed to building something out, and they see what these impacts are. They're crazy in the visuals, but not in the resultant data. And there's something that we started noticing with kids, which we'll get to after this as well.
So this is where we ended up getting to, just on the data side, was actual metrics, actual takeaways. So we realized that, at the end of this activity, that there are these trade-offs, and as an urban planner, actually engaging with this design and building process and activity, that you're never going to create a perfect design, that you're going to have to make really, really hard decisions.
And yeah, and I remember this one email that you sent me, Kubi, of like these kids who were just, I think it was like 4 hours later, the parents were like, I need to get my kids out of here. But these the kids are actually sitting there trying to like get like the highest point. And
They were getting
they're
dehydrated.
And we have pictures with like kids with their parents, like, multi-generational sort of engagement to build these things out. It's kind of wild because you also start realizing what the duration of engagement is, and it's on the order of many, many, many minutes, and sometimes hours, which is very rare in the museum world, even in children's museums.
So just to zoom out a little bit, this is just a quick snapshot of what we landed on aesthetically, and also you can see here there's a top bar with the responsive metrics. So as visitors are, in this instance, they're designing a park, they can create these really layered, complex scenes with many, many, many kind of crazy looking graphics layered all on top of one another. Each of those graphics actually has a meaning, it has an intent. You can click on them, you can learn more. They're not just random, they're actually each element we really considered as a component of what New York might look like. And you're getting this responsiveness in the top bar telling you how your design is performing on the kind of urban planning scale.
So just to talk about, like, we did a fair amount of thinking up front about how much we want to analyze on people's engagement. But a key thing that we noticed is these are stats from actually yesterday, which is this is just showing the number of activities that were generated on a daily basis. And what this is showing is that this has remained pretty consistent for the last year. We're still creating about 100 activities a day. So far, it's been about 26,000 activities that people have created in the space. And this is kind of telling because it means that the experience hasn't become dated yet, even though people have their own devices. So ultimately, the storytelling mechanism is what really has been beneficial here. But I think Cathy's going to go into much more detail on that.
Yeah. So I don't have too much time, but so along the way, yeah. Yeah, sorry. Is this one working? Okay, sorry. I thought it would pick me up. So we know a lot now about how people are experiencing this unique space. Again, a gallery on the future situated in a history and city museum. And we know all of this from a couple rounds of formative evaluation, but also an extensive summative evaluation of the entire New York at its core exhibition. And so we looked at all three galleries, and specifically for the lab, a few sort of big ideas arose about people's holistic experience. And the main one that stuck out to us was that visitors understood that the lab is an experimental place, right? They understood that this is a place, they picked up on it, whether or not they read the sort of orienting introduction text that is there, they got right away based on all these activities that this is a place where the museum is inviting them to share their ideas and their vision for the future. At the same time, they were excited about it, there's a lot of cool stuff, but they also had mixed feelings about this idea because ultimately, and perhaps in part because they may have been primed from the two historical galleries that they visited before entering this space, they were curious to see what they called professionals' perspectives on the future. So Kubi and Sundar and Kate mentioned that finding this balance of, sort of this idea of you said predicting the future is inherently, people do a bad job of it, so you sort of actively resisted showing what professionals, be they designers, architects, politicians, city planners, what they're envisioning and what they're working on, leaving some of that out to allow for visitor-generated designs. There was sort of a balance, a mixed feeling in the sense that visitors were really excited to experiment, but also kind of felt like they needed a little bit more of that primer. So that's something that we're grappling with, and we know all of this from extensive interviews we did with people about their time in the lab. And just sort of another quick point that came up, the New York at its core, as Kubi mentioned, is 3 galleries, sort of 2 historical and this lab on the future. Overall, visitors did spend less time in the lab than they did in the 2 historical galleries. Fatigue always plays into that. If they visited in chronological order, they might have just been tired, but They were also, one thing that may have played in as well was their sense of orientation and what is this and who is this for. We talked to visitors about, based on their experience, who did they think the museum designed the Future City Lab for? And we got a range of responses, but the primary trends that really arose was that people thought it was for young people. And what's interesting about why is that they thought it was for young people because young people are geared towards the future more so than adults, at least in visitors' minds. They're the ones who the future is for. And this is just an interesting, I'm sure you guys have thoughts on what to do about this. They also said things like, oh, it's probably a little bit more for people who live in New York than for me, which I don't even necessarily know that that's true because all of these are issues that affect any urban environment, whether you live in New York City or not. But yeah, that was something else that arose. So this question of orientation of you're entering this space that's inherently experimental, and who do you think it's for, and what cues you into that is something that the museum has to grapple with. And finally, sort of to end on a really positive note, even with all of these mixed feelings and maybe questions about what the lab is and who it's for, ultimately people were really intrigued by all of the tech that's in here. As we've mentioned a couple of times already, there are no objects in this space. That's inherently rare for a museum space at all. This is something that's on the future. It's highly interactive, and people really enjoyed their experiences. Even if they were sometimes confused maybe about what fed the metrics that they experienced in those activity tables, about some of the other strategies that they were able to explore. They had questions. They were intrigued, and it's a really successful space in that way. So a lot to mull over, but a lot of really positive outcomes as well.
So, with all of that for us, it was a question of what do we do with this? Because the analytics is great. In the case of building out these sorts of environments where we're thinking about telling the story of the future, we're always we wish we knew what all of these analytics were ahead of time so that we could build for it. In a weird way, we did actually. We go through this process of how do we want to feel at the end of it?
Yeah.
And there are a lot of trade-offs that happen. And it's super helpful to go through this process repeatedly. And I think it's something that everyone should be very cognizant of. Analytics, user requests, user forums, things like this are super important as we go through stuff. But in reflecting on what we did in the design process, obviously there were compromises that were made, but it has been super helpful for us to even look at, okay, why is it that this has been engaging, whereas in other instances we haven't seen so much? Why is it that 100 people or 100 creations still happen every single day, or thereabouts, on a consistent basis? It is very good for us to kind of keep track as we build new experiences like this. So.
Sure. So, yeah, I'll just very quickly address kind of the museum's take on the evaluation. So I think part of it for us was not super surprising in the sense that this is an unusual, somewhat experimental space, and I think people come to it with certain expectations, right? Especially if they're not coming specifically to see that, and so it's not that surprising to me that in confounding those expectations, it's not going to be for everyone, and not everyone's going to want to make that extra effort. Initially, when I saw the results, I was a little bit disappointed that people weren't more excited about putting their own voice, their own views out there. But since then, I've thought a little bit more about, the fact that we supposedly live in this, post-truth world where trust in institutional expertise and expertise in general is supposedly at its lowest level. The fact that people really do crave real information and insight in a case like this, and that's what they go to museums for, was also heartening to me. It was also heartening because we actually have that in there. It just wasn't foregrounded. Yeah. So just to end with, we call this a lab because it's obviously a place for experimentation for our visitors, but it's also a place for experimentation for us. And so we're taking all this into consideration. We do actually plan to do some pretty major reconfiguration of at least parts of the lab to address this feedback and to reconfigure the space as well as the signage and to foreground some of the material that's actually already there that people say they want to make it more obvious when they walk in where to find it.
And I think one of the things worth mentioning is that a lot of what we did in the design process was also try to make as much of this future-proof as possible, which is kind of audacious on some level, because it can't really be. But at least as much as possible is CMS controlled. As Kubi mentioned, the map table is all of the data on that is controllable through a web-based CMS, which is dynamically rendering. In most instances like this, these are just video feeds that have to go back through a render process, and that's expensive. So we've got an entire like pipeline that allows this to be built out by the museum themselves. Significant aspects of the game can be changed just by changing assets. The entire thing is controllable from a CMS again. All of this stuff as we move forward, like the collaboration with the museum to like keep this relevant as they evolve this has been part of the original thinking as well. So. But,
Great.
Thanks.
I think we've got a few minutes for questions.
Hi, Matt. Love the stuff. It's great. Actually, I wasn't even thinking when I came in about that one specific room. I was thinking about sort of all the digital that you guys have done recently, including those kiosks with the interviews on them and stuff like that. So this is sort of a question about, as you think about these experimental spaces, right? One of the things I'm really thinking about a lot is how one digital experience, almost more than a non-digital experience, affects other digital experiences. And so how do you think about that relatively sort of standard, not to be pejorative, but standard sort of kiosk type thing, and then this sort of stuff, and does that instantly cause those things to date? Or what's what's the approach, what's the thought that goes into that, having an experimental space? Or just random digital stuff everywhere, which is it's not focused as experimental.
I think it's hard. I mean, we obviously want to move away from something that feels standard, but it's a good point, and I think we grapple with it all the time. Like kiosks are things that show up everywhere. These things that are like monoliths. I mean, even IDM's advertising now shows these monoliths all over the place. It's difficult to move away from it because the expectation from visitors is pretty standard. When you break that mold, it's very difficult. A standard thing that I know this has become like almost like a tome now, that every vendor is like, oh yeah, everyone wants something innovative, but they want us to show them first what this thing is, and we can't because it hasn't been built yet. But it is this process that we go through. Like we want to get to a point where it's interfaces that people haven't dealt with before, but that's obviously difficult because people are used to certain gestures and whatever else. The other thing we grapple with is that the technology in their pockets are going to be far superior to anything we build within a year. So our story is not about making the technology or these interfaces into something standardized or like they feel super fresh every single time. It's like, what is the content behind it, and can we make that content foregrounded? So we're hoping that that's what we've been able to convey with some of these designs, but that's.
Any other questions?
Time for one more? No?
Can you talk about the decision to make the cards analog rather than digital that physically were coming out? And whether in the end, in hindsight, do you think that was the right choice or not?
Yeah, sure. So the question was about the cards versus making those analog versus digital, and we did think very hard about that. I mean, part of it was just to counteract screen fatigue, because there are quite a lot of screens here, and also to provide something that's interactive and engaging for people who may not be so comfortable with technology. But I think that there's something also really powerful about seeing people's handwriting as opposed to just having something typed on a screen. You really get a different sense of who that person might be. I mean, we have tens of thousands of school kids coming through every year, for example, and they submit a lot of questions, and you see a question written in a child's handwriting, it just has a completely different take, than if it was just written on a screen. And I think again, I'd hesitate to call them analytics, but we have, as I said, many thousands of submissions on these, and I think that in and of itself is testament to the fact that it is very popular. I mean, I think just inherently, especially for a certain generation, something that's physical, that you can just sit down and start writing, has, for some people at least, a lower barrier to entry than if you have to figure out kind of what you're doing on a screen.
Yeah, and I can speak to that a little bit from the evaluation data as well. That's called the WhatIf Table, and it was actually one of the most popular and most stopped at components in this entire space. And I think that Kubi can speak to whether it was necessarily intended as this or not, but I think that for visitors, it was the most stopped at. They spent a lot of time when they were there, and they talked about it really high regard for the space. And I think what it ended up doing, whether or not this was the intention, was serving as a bit of an orientation to what the lab is. So getting you started in a quite simple way before you dive into all of the screen stuff. Just sort of, okay, so we're thinking about the future. What if this? And here's a little bit of data to help prime your thinking. But what do you think about this? And it's this simple, very orienting piece that again and again in the interview data from our evaluation, came up as something that really, again, served as an orientation to what the space is and helped ground people in this idea of a lab about the future in a museum where they've just gone through 2 historical galleries. I think, the data from our evaluation at least show that it was a pretty well-received thing, and there was sort of no data that ever suggested that people felt like it didn't fit. If anything, it primed people really well for everything else that they were about to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.